In 2022, 274 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Preventing, mitigating, and responding to humanitarian crises is a challenge. Can fiction and storytelling play a role? Can it raise awareness and motivate action to address the causes and consequences of humanitarian crises? My name is Ruth Mukwana, and I host the SAHA podcast, Stories and Humanitarian Action. Welcome to the SAHA podcast, Stories and Humanitarian Action. I have a great guest for you today. Before I introduce her, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you enjoy today's conversation, like, comment, and share it. My guest today is Pham, the Senior Gender Advisor with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Welcome, Apo, to the show today.
Thanks, Ruth. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I know we've been trying to do this for quite some time, so I'm excited that we've been able to find the time.
Yes, we're both very busy. So I am full of admiration for you that with your very busy schedule, you can still manage to put all of this podcasts into action.
Yeah, it's a passion of mine, and I kind of feel I just have to find the time to do it. So tell me about yourself. What do you do? Tell me about your job. What does a typical day look like for you?
So I come from a refugee background. I was born in Vietnam and came to Australia as a refugee in one of the earliest boat people to leave Vietnam during the war. And so that experience, I think, really shapes who I am and the values that I, bring forward to the world. I am Australian in terms of my citizenship, but currently living in New York. And I guess my typical day is I get up, I have a fantastic cup of coffee made by my partner, and this is around
Nice.
6:30. I scroll through Twitter. This is my daily routine, just to check, what's happening in the world, and then I take it from there. And then I, really get into the workday very early from 7 in the morning, reviewing documents, checking what the trends and issues are. And because I work in humanitarian crises, it's around monitoring, the situations in the various emergencies in the world, looking for opportunities to promote issues around gender equality, and to really amplify the experiences of women and girls in crises. So I guess that leads me to the point about what I do for work, which is I'm a senior gender advisor. And often people say, what does a senior gender advisor do, in emergencies,
Yeah, I was
right?
going to ask.
And I guess it's several folds, but for me, it's very much trying to be that advocate, be that voice, to really amplify the experiences of women and girls in crisis, and to bring attention to the issues and what else we should be thinking about in these crises, given that in all of the emergencies we see in the world, women and girls are so disproportionately impacted. And I guess that also comes down to the fact that in peacetime they are already experiencing so many difficulties and challenges. So of course, in crises, that gets further exacerbated. So what can we do, as people who work in these spaces to bring more attention to their experiences and also their leadership? What is it that communities and in particular women are doing to address some of the needs and the issues that they're experiencing?
Right. And maybe as I was thinking about speaking to you, I normally ask this general question like, what are the key humanitarian challenges? What are the key consequences of humanitarian challenges. But I wonder if we can just really zoom in on women and girls, especially given that you're the senior gender advisor for OCHA. But just talk to me about like what are some of the key challenges for women and girls facing a humanitarian crisis?
Mm-hmm. And thanks for the question, Ruth. I guess I'm still quite concerned about the lack of just basic needs for women and girls. And a primary example is women's access, or women and girls' access to hygiene materials. Now it's 2022, and I find it a little bit concerning that we're still talking about, women and girls having access to something as basic and fundamental, as sanitary materials. And of course, many of us take this for granted, but in an emergency, and in many of the places that we work in, when people are fleeing without any resources, the lack of these materials can really hinder the participation of women and girls in just daily lives. And to give you an example, I was in Ethiopia on a support mission. And when I talked to women and girls that were in displacement camps, and when I talked to the local service providers about, what's the most urgent pressing need that you have at the moment? And two critical issues arose. And this resonates not only in Ethiopia, in many different places. But firstly, this issue of the lack of hygiene materials was a big impediment. Women would say that they spend days in their shelters or in their tents when they are menstruating because they don't have materials and they're too embarrassed to go outside in case they leak. Girls would say, with a lot of embarrassment, that they don't go to school when they have their periods. So that's, 3 to 5 days that girls are missing from going to school because they don't have access to these very basic things. And I think, that's to do with the lack of priority that we give to women and girls' needs. And if there's anything to be sacrificed in terms of services or products, this is the first thing that is omitted from, say, a kit that goes to a family. So I do think that it's quite alarming that we're still talking about this issue. And then the second, I think, most urgent issue is around gender-based violence, and in particular sexual violence. We see this a lot in emergencies because in reality, across the world, it's still 1 in 3 women who are experiencing or who have experienced some form of violence in their lives. And so, when you go into a crisis situation, this is further compounded. We see this situation at the moment in Haiti, for example, where gang violence, is further exacerbating women and girls' exposure to sexual violence, where sexual violence is being used as a strategy to punish rival gangs, where sexual violence is used as a way to control women. And also women engage in, sexual relationships with people who are wielding power because that's their means to survive. So just to give one example, but gang violence and gang sexual violence is a very extreme end. We also have, violence that women and girls are experiencing every day in a displaced setting, when they're walking from, their campsite to the latrines, when they're walking to seek water or food. And especially now with drought and with, climate events further making those situations worse, women and girls are finding that they're having to walk even longer distances, which means that they're exposed to banditry, violence, and many forms of gender-based violence as well.
Yeah, no, and gender-based violence, sexual violence. I know we do talk a lot about, but I also know, especially, and part of the reason I really do this project, part of the reason I'm passionate about storytelling is that I don't think the numbers that we have, the reports that go out, really help us understand the trauma of sexual violence, of gender based violence. And so, to me, getting those stories that help us feel it in some
Mhm,
way, I find them powerful. But going back to this question of hygiene, and it is always on my mind, and of course, number one, I am a woman, but and my own experience is nothing in comparison. But I often find, like, I just came back from Pakistan and I had to be on the road for hours and hours, and I was in my period. And I could not imagine anything more stressful in that moment for me than being in a car with male colleagues
mhm,
and needing to use the bathroom every hour or so on
mhm,
the road, and at the same time listening to women and young girls who had been displaced by the floods
mhm.
telling me they are using leaves
Yeah.
because they don't have, tampons or sanitary towels.
Mhm.
So, it's quite, and I don't think we talk enough about it.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I feel even in some cultures, people are embarrassed to talk about periods.
Mhm.
It's like that part of life that I don't know, somehow we think it doesn't exist.
Exactly, because it's women's issues. And and I think to this point that you raise in terms of we don't talk about it enough, absolutely agree. Sometimes I jokingly, out of anger, say that should be the first issue for any emergency, for any humanitarian stakeholder, for any humanitarian leader. The humanitarian country team first order of business should be, do we have hygiene materials for women and girls? Can we just get this issue over and done with before we move on to access and negotiating with the government and whatever else that we discuss? But it doesn't have that prioritization. And I think that renders women and girls and their needs and their experiences invisible. And if it's invisible, then it doesn't get prioritized. Then we don't mobilize resources. I go into a room and I talk about sanitary materials, and it's like you could just see the room go, oh, really? Why are we talking about this? This can't be that important. And it really is. I think it's the most urgent issue, in a crisis because it's impacting half of the population, for a quarter of a month that they're having
Yeah,
to
right.
contend with. I mean, it's not a luxury to have access to these materials. And so I do think it hinders how someone can participate and engage in decision making or in the care of their families or in the care of their communities if they can't even have access to things that help them care for themselves. And so I do think, that's why I think that we are failing as a humanitarian system to women and girls because this fundamental basic need is not being met.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, you also articulated it very well. It's not just that, we are in our periods and we can cope by, you can't go to school if you're a
Mhm,
child. You can't go to the
mhm.
market, if you can't, access your livelihoods and income. But it's also a question of dignity, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that, that's for me one of the things that women and girls want. They want to be self reliant, they want to be able to determine their own lives. And it's really hard to do that when you don't have even the most basic means.
Yeah. And I know, because one of the things I always think a lot about, especially for me as a woman, we have all of these issues, and you've said it, domestic violence or violence generally against women is a problem globally. And so when we end up in conflict situations, it just is exacerbated. But I do want to ask you a question as well, though, around gender equality and gender inequality and how that is also exacerbated when we are, in this humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, I think gender-based violence is something that is more visible because it's tangible, right? We can see, we hear the stories. But when it comes to other forms of inequality, women not being able to, dress how they want, women not being at the decision-making table, to inform humanitarians like us about what their needs are, how they think the humanitarian response should be, or what kind of livelihoods. So, not being able to participate, I think, is a critical area of inequality. And right now, in the humanitarian sector, we're still very male dominated. And so when you're so male dominated, there are, locations that we work in, or that I visited where, it's mostly men. And so when you're the one woman, trying to, raise particular issues, it becomes a bit more challenging. So I think, when we talk about gender, inequalities, it's around trying to give visibility to some of those different experiences, of both men and women and what their needs are. And I guess that's what we try to do, or what I try to do in the humanitarian space, is to really foster better gender analysis, so that we can understand all of these different dimensions, how are different groups of women impacted. And it's actually worse for women and girls with disabilities, because they aren't able to access services because of restricted mobility. Adolescent girls, again, very much missing from decision making because they fall, between being an adult, having responsibilities, and being considered a child. But in many contexts, child marriage is an experience for many girls who are between 13 and 18. And so, being forced to grow up, being forced to be an adult, being forced to have children way before you're ready, I think is a huge burden, on women and girls. And I think, when it comes to some of these broader issues, they don't get enough attention. This gender dimension, how women and girls are having particular experiences. And back to the issue of the menstrual hygiene, this is a totally gendered issue. It is around women's access to resources, and we're just really failing on that.
Yeah. No, and I mean, you're also touching upon diversity, I guess, and why it is important. I just know that I just had this experience just recently when I was in this room full of male colleagues and decision makers talking about maternal health,
Mhm.
and just trying to, in my mind, wrap my head around, you know, how it is that for such an important discussion where women really should have, you know, the most input, and then what we miss, right? By not having the right analysis, by not having the right solutions, and
Mhm.
suddenly, yeah,
And having those different perspectives, right? I remember
yeah,
once working in a setting where one colleague said to me, was telling me this story of not having a female toilet because the team was all men before she turned up. And when she said, I think we need a trash bin in the bathroom, the shared bathroom, they all were so perplexed as to, I don't understand why you would need a trash bin in there. And,
right,
she had to explain. And then they all went, oh my goodness, they just didn't see it because that was not their lived experience. So I think,
absolutely,
to your point about why diversity and different perspectives at a decision making level is so critical, because it brings in these different dimensions that, perhaps others don't see. And whether that's, because
yeah,
of your gender, because of your, role in society, because of your age, so many different factors.
yeah. And what can we do to improve this? If you had to choose one, two things that we can do to change the lives of millions of women and girls. caught up in humanitarian crisis, what would that be for you?
I can't reduce it to any one thing. There's like so many things we need to do. Um, but I think, firstly, it's listening and taking action. Because I think, often I'm so tired of this rhetoric of, we need to listen to women or we need to listen to the affected, communities. No, we don't need to just listen. We actually need to do a lot more. Communities don't want you to just listen to them, right? Women want you to listen to the experiences and then use that to shape policy, to shape programs, to make sure it's funded, to make sure they get, their sanitary materials. They do not want you to listen, go away and do nothing. And I think, so for me, it goes beyond listening. It's about responding. So how do we actively listen to women and girls and respond to their needs in a way that is meaningful? And when I say meaningful, it's about trying to engage them and to bring them to the decision making table, because women and girls, are not just, victims, are not just experiencing inequalities, but they are, survivors. They are agents of change. They are leaders in their communities, formal or informal. And we need to be leveraging that so much more. So I think, for me, listening, responding, and promoting that leadership.
Right. And I guess to me also you're touching upon, giving women and girls voices, and I mean this is one of the things I'm really really obsessed with, as you know,
Mm,
the power of agency, um, and making sure that to the you know to the most that we can, that actually people can have the space to tell their stories the way they want to tell them.
hmm Yeah. And I think, for me, giving space to people to tell their stories and allow those stories to inform our action. Because I
Yeah.
think, bringing people to an event to speak so that we can listen is not enough. And I feel that, we do that a lot in our sector. And sometimes I feel like communities should be pushing back and saying, actually, no, I'm not going to come and tell you what my needs are anymore. You know what they are. You need to now just take action. Um,
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but at the same time, I want to push back on this a little bit, in a sense that I feel, yes, we do bring people affected by crisis, women, refugees, internally displaced men, children, but I tend to feel like we bring them to help us with a narrative that is in many ways already predetermined. And so often I wonder, is this what this person wants to talk about
mhm.
right
Yeah.
now? Is this the only part of their story that they want
hmm
to tell to the Security Council? Because I often find, like, yeah, we can talk about the need for hygiene products or food or water, but sometimes I wonder, is this what this person wants to talk about?
hmm
And is
Yeah.
this the only aspect? Like, has their life just come down to these needs?
Absolutely. And it's very interesting you say that. And this is where I have, a challenge with doing humanitarian work, because I think, we're so siloed or a little bit narrow in the way that we think about humanitarian action. Because when I talk to communities, they're not talking in just these basic needs, right? When you talk to
Right.
people, what
Yeah.
is it that you want? They're saying, I want a better future. I want opportunities. I want to make decisions about my own life. I want an education. I want to learn new skills, and so whether you put that in the bucket of development or in the bucket of humanitarian action, that's for you. But for the person having those experiences, they're talking in broad terms. What is it that they want, in life? And that's, peace, security, and opportunities, and rights. Because that's, often people say, yeah, I just want the right to live with, dignity, and the right to
Yeah.
have freedom of movement. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and this I think is a good moment to segue into a little bit of storytelling. And so, of course, in the podcast, in this conversation, I like to talk about humanitarian challenges, but I also like to talk about stories, your own personal stories, stories of people you've met along the way in your career, but also a book set in a humanitarian crisis that has impacted you or that you've thought a lot about. Um, so, do you have any story, any book set in a humanitarian crisis that has stayed with you? And what
Mhm.
would that book be?
I am profoundly affected by a book called A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mystery. And this was a book written, I think, in the mid 90s, and set in the 70s in political turmoil in India, and it centers around four characters living and trying to survive in their slums in India, and all of the experiences and challenges that they have. And I remember this book because I had to take a day off after I finished the book because I was so sad and depressed. And no book has ever made me feel that way. And this is how it really affected me. I just remember finishing this book and saying, what the hell was this about? Like, why is this so awful? Why is the world so awful? It's just one bad thing after the other for these characters. But of course, on reflection and, when I read it again, yes, the anger was still there, but I also saw these glimmers of hopes, for these people, and the tremendous resilience and the dignity with which they tried to live their lives, even in the most, horrible of circumstances. And so it really, for me, it really resonates with why I choose to do this work. And when I say this work, it's not humanitarian work, but it's social justice. Because I started my career, working with young people as a youth worker,
Mm-hmm.
working with young people who've been in detention centers, who have had a criminal record, who were homeless, who were on drugs. So really seeing the systemic issues or the structures in society that have led to, young people being so downtrodden. And so this book really resonates in highlighting, the opportunities or the lack of opportunities that people have determine, the outcomes. And for me, it makes me reflect on I could have had any of those lives if not for the opportunities. So what people really want and need and what we need to be fostering are opportunities for people to, get on with their lives. And when I say opportunities, those opportunities are not just found in humanitarian spaces. Actually, those opportunities are connected to development work, are connected to peace and security. How do we work and engage with, governments and societies in a way that helps economic development, helps communities to have possibilities of education and livelihoods, and growth for themselves. And so I constantly think about this book because of the interplay, or I guess this balance between tragedy and hope. That there is
Mm-hmm.
always hope and dignity, even in these terrible circumstances. And what what redeems these situations for me are the people and the connections people have with each other. And so these four characters found each other and remained connected. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that really stood out when I was reading it again a couple of months ago was there's a scene where so basically they're all tailors, right? And they live in this,
Mm-hmm.
little house. And after they make the clothes for, whoever is delivering the work, they keep the leftover fabrics. And Dina, the main character, is weaving a quilt from all of these little
Mm-hmm.
pieces of fabric. But actually, in one of the scenes, they're going, "Oh, that piece of fabric. Oh, that was the day that we ate at that cafe. Oh, that fabric
Mm-hmm.
was the day when we got beaten up." So the little pieces of fabric were telling stories and was
Mm-hmm.
connecting all of their life experiences, over however long it was. And I think that was just really profound for me because it's really reinforcing that we're all made up of all of these little stories, good and bad. And one of the characters, I can't remember which one right now, but was saying, "Oh, that was a really bad moment that fabric triggers for me." And Dina
Right.
says, "Yeah, I think we can remove that if you like." And he goes, "No,
Oh,
like it wouldn't be the same if you remove it, right?" So
yeah.
basically, it just speaks to this resilience that yes, you have to have these, negative experiences connected to all of these other positive experiences, and all of this shape, who you are. So yeah, so I just really like the book because of the stories that it tells about people and their hopes and
Mm-hmm.
desires, and that everyone clings, even when they're despairing, is clinging to some kind of hope.
Yeah.
And yes, so rereading it again, gave me at least that.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to take a
Yeah.
day off work the second time around.
Right. No, I've read A Fine Balance, but I read it a long, long time ago. And I think, like you, to me, and I always want to read it again. It's such a big book, too.
Mm,
But it is that profound sadness. And I remember what really stood out for me is that, and this is now from my memory of the story,
mhm,
but I just remember being impacted by, one bad thing happening to these characters and
mm,
feeling like they just never got a break. Or even when they got those moments of breaks, they were so momentary. And
absolutely.
that I found extremely heartbreaking, you know. But tell
Yes,
me, so I mean, think
mhm.
thinking about a fine balance as well, and storytelling and fiction. Is there anything that this book you feel taught you, or when you read it, or when you think about it?
Um, I read the book in the 90s, and this was when I was starting my career as a youth worker. And I think that, that's also why it's had such an impact on me because I was very much around, working as an activist, working around social justice. And the book for me was a stark reminder of, why I do this work. It was affirming the values that I want to bring into the world as we started in the conversation. And for me, it's around, yes, you have to be angry. You can't be doing just social justice work if you're not angry. We have to be angry and we have to channel that anger into some kind of action. So for me, my very strong reaction to it is what stays with me because that's anger is where is my starting point for anything. And I actually nurture that and I think it's healthy because, to do what I
Yeah,
do, to push for gender equality, to promote women's rights, in so many different contexts, and getting constant pushback. Every step forward is three steps backwards, can be quite disheartening. And so the anger, keeps me going. And so for
yeah,
me, the book really cements that, desire to really make change.
yeah. No, and going to slowly start wrapping up for us. So maybe I have just a couple or three more questions for you. Is if you think about any situation, any person through your work that has had a profound impact on you, what is that situation? Who is that person?
Um, I once worked, actually, one of my first supervisors is a very beautiful human being that taught me so much about being open and not judging people. He was a hippie. He was a youth worker. He was just very, I can't find the right word, but he was Christian. And so I think with that, I'm an atheist. So, working with someone who, was very open about, being a person of God at the time was a little bit confronting. But as I worked with this person, he was no longer, somebody who was Christian. He actually displayed in action the values, through his church, basically. So he was kind, he was generous, and promoted social justice, and was actually a very progressive person. So that for me that challenged me, because it taught me, or reminded me, I guess, to not judge people because of, a particular religion or a particular label. I had all of these stereotypes about him being a hippie, and then when he said he was Christian. Um, and so it was the first time that I had to check myself and my own preconceptions. I constantly go back to him, and, when I have moments, where I'm being prejudiced, to remind
Yeah.
myself that, yeah, like, of course we all have our biases, but it's, this was a prime example of, judging someone and being totally wrong. So
Yeah.
that's one person in my life that that taught me a lot about prejudice and bias.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing this story and this experience of this beautiful human. I think we all need beautiful humans who inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. And my last question for you, Apo, is is there any action that you can think about if someone, whoever will listen to our conversation, if there was one action that they could take to improve the lives of women and girls caught up in humanitarian crisis, what would that action be for you?
um, I really think, going back to the earlier points, that we've talked about, people need to be making visible the experiences and the voices and the participation of women and girls. We need to all
Yeah.
be champions, for women and girls and their experiences, given that, this is half of the population of the world. So how can we all be much more, stronger, in the way that we speak to these issues, and the way in which we, promote the responses to them. So, I was saying earlier that, I think any and every humanitarian should have, menstrual health or menstrual hygiene as the first order of business. Actually, if we actually did that, that's a really good start.
Good. Thank you. Do you have any questions for me?
No, but thank you so much for the conversation. I feel like could have talked a lot more on so many different issues.
Well, I know, and of course, I'm happy to invite you back another time. But thank you so much for making the time. I know you're extremely busy. I know you're traveling tomorrow, so thank you so much. And it's really been a pleasure to speak with you.
And thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Apple. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel at Saha Podcast. I'd like to thank Jamal Swift, my co-producer, and the Nomadic Band for the music. Thank you. Goodbye.